Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. We're going to be diving into a really interesting area today. Instructional manipulatives. You know those physical objects we use to learn.
Oh, yeah. It's a fascinating area. Things like blocks for math or models for science. Like a lot of people, I used to think that learning by doing, that physical interaction, just made learning better, period.
Right, it's sort of intuitive, isn't it? That hands-on experience just makes things stick. But the article we're looking at today suggests things might be a bit more complicated than that. It's called an Embedded and Embodied Cognition Review of Instructional Manipulatives.
And that's a great review. What we're going to see is that the connection between how we learn and these tools, these manipulatives, is, well, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it makes you think twice about that hands-on is best idea, doesn't it? I mean, we want to understand, does all that richness, all those ways you can see them, touch them, move them, does that always actually help you learn better? Or are there maybe some downsides?
That's the question, isn't it? Now, one perspective the article talks about is called the moderate view. And what's cool about this is it suggests that all that richness, all those sensory details, they might actually end up overloading you. Like your brain might get so caught up in processing all that stuff that it's actually harder to learn the concept itself.
Almost like it becomes a distraction in a way. Too much going on.
That's the idea. And then the article talks about embedded and embodied cognition, which is a whole different way of looking at how we learn.
So two very different ideas. Why don't we start with the moderate view? As a learner, what are the main concerns there for you?
Well, I guess the main concern is they talk about this thing called cognitive load.
Cognitive load, yeah.
And the basic idea is that your brain can only handle so much information at once,
Hmm.
right? So if you're trying to learn something new, but you're also having to process a ton of other information, it can be harder to really get it.
Makes sense. Like if you were trying to learn, I don't know, a new language while juggling at the same time.
Exactly. The juggling is going to take up a lot of your mental energy, leaving less for the language learning. So the moderate view suggests that really rich manipulatives, lots of colors, textures, all those different ways to interact, that can actually increase your cognitive load because you're using up brain power just to process all that sensory input.
Oh, so it's not just the physical interaction itself, it's all the extra stuff that comes along with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other concern is this idea of transfer. Like you want to be able to take what you've learned and apply it in new situations, right?
Right. It's not just about knowing how to do something with the manipulative itself. It's about understanding the underlying concept.
Right. And the moderate view says that for that to happen, you need to move from those concrete examples to more abstract, symbolic wars of thinking.
So like with fractions, it's not enough to know how to cut a pizza into equal slices. You also need to understand what the fraction symbols actually mean.
Exactly. And the worry is that if the manipulatives are too rich, too engaging on that sensory level, you might get stuck at that concrete level and struggle to make that jump to the abstract.
And we actually see this idea playing out in the real world, right? The article mentions how there's been a trend towards virtual manipulatives, like those things you interact with on a computer screen.
Yeah, where you're clicking and dragging stuff around. And in a way, that makes sense from the moderate view,
Yeah.
right? Because you're reducing a lot of that physical richness.
You're not feeling the texture, you're not using your hands in quite the same way.
Right. And so the thinking is that this could actually help you focus on the core concepts without getting bogged down by all the extra sensory stuff.
So that's the moderate view. A lot to think about there. Now let's switch gears and talk about embedded cognition.
This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, what's the core idea there?
Well, with embedded cognition, the key idea is that your mind, it isn't this isolated thing operating in a vacuum.
Right.
It's constantly interacting with your body and with the environment. And those things actually shape the way you think.
Okay, so it's not just that we use our bodies and the environment to help us think. It's more like those things are actually part of the thinking process itself.
Exactly. They're not just tools. They're part of the system.
Mm-hmm.
Like, think about making a grocery list. You're basically using that piece of paper as an extension of your memory, right? You're offloading information so you don't have to hold it all in your head.
Right, right. Or like using your fingers to count. Your body becomes a tool for solving the problem.
Exactly. Or even something like using landmarks to navigate. The environment itself is acting as a memory aid. And so when you learn with manipulatives, you're basically in this constant back and forth with those external objects.
It's this really dynamic interaction. So it's not just about offloading information either. It's about how that interaction actually shapes your thinking.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The environment can actually lead to new ideas, new insights that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
That makes sense. Like when you sketch out an idea on a whiteboard, sometimes just seeing it visually can help you make connections you wouldn't have made otherwise.
That's a perfect example. The article actually mentions this idea of a minimal memory strategy. They did a study where people were sorting blocks, and they found that people were constantly looking back and forth between the model, the available blocks, and their workspace.
So instead of trying to memorize the entire pattern, they were using the environment to help them keep track of things.
Exactly. They were grabbing little bits of information as they needed them, relying on the environment to reduce their cognitive load.
And then, of course, there's the classic Tetris example. Like, how does that illustrate embedded cognition?
Well, with Tetris, they found that skilled players would often rotate a piece, even if they weren't going to use it right away. And they weren't just doing this randomly, they were doing it to see how it might fit into different spots. So it was like they were using the act of rotation to help them understand the possibilities.
So the physical interaction was actually a way of thinking through the problem.
Exactly. It was reducing the mental effort of trying to visualize everything in their head.
And it's not just Tetris, right? The article talks about how we use external resources all the time.
Yeah, like that study about programming a VCR, remember those?
Oh, yeah, those were the days.
She would constantly be switching between trying to remember the steps and looking them up in the manual.
Which is basically what we all do with Google now.
Right. It's about finding the path of least resistance.
Now, the article also introduces this thing called the theory of physically distributed learning. How does that fit into all this?
Well, it basically takes these ideas of embedded cognition and expands on them. It says that the environment doesn't just support your existing thinking, it can actually lead to new ways of thinking altogether.
Okay, how so?
Well, they talk about two main processes. One is repurposing, like with Tetris, where you're using rotation for exploration. But then there's mutual adaptation, which is where your interactions with the environment actually spark new ideas. Like, you wouldn't have had that idea if you hadn't been interacting with the environment in that particular way.
And the candy example really illustrates that, right? Like
Yeah.
trying to figure out 1/4 of 8.
Exactly. A kid might start out just guessing, but by physically moving the candies around, trying to divide them into groups, they might actually discover what dividing into equal parts means. The physical manipulation leads to the understanding.
And the findings from those studies with the fraction problems, using pie wedges versus tiles, were also pretty interesting.
Right? They found that when kids could physically manipulate the materials, whether it was pie wedges or tiles, they were more successful at solving fraction problems. And it wasn't just about seeing a pre-divided shape, it was the act of partitioning the materials themselves that seemed to be key.
So the action, the doing, is really important.
Exactly. And that was also true in that physics diagram task. Just looking at a 3D model didn't help that much. But when students could actually rotate the model, their ability to translate between 2D diagrams and the 3D object, it improves significantly.
Almost like they were using the model to externalize the mental process of rotation.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
It really highlights how the physical interaction can support and even guide the cognitive process.
Now, the article does raise a really interesting question. Do you get the same benefits if you just watch someone else manipulate the objects?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one that researchers are still exploring. While you can definitely learn from observation, it seems like that active hands-on manipulation might be especially important for really internalizing those cognitive processes.
Okay. So now let's talk about how prior knowledge and the structure of the materials themselves interact. That fraction problem with the pie wedges versus the tiles was a really good example of that.
Right, because the pie wedges, they were pre-structured. They already represented the part-whole relationship. And that was helpful for kids who already had a good understanding of fractions, especially for addition problems. But when they got to multiplication problems where their prior knowledge was weaker, the structure didn't really help.
So if you already have a solid foundation, you can leverage a structured environment more effectively.
Exactly. But there's a potential downside too, right? The kids who learned with those pie wedges, they actually showed less transfer to other types of manipulatives than the kids who used the more open-ended tiles.
Because they never really had to figure out the part-whole relationship for themselves. It was given to them.
Right. The environment did too much of the work for them.
And that brings us to that study with the numerical partitioning, where they were using the physical blocks. That showed how the possibilities for interaction really matter, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. The fact that kids came up with more diverse solutions when they could use both hands, that was really telling. It highlighted how something as simple as being able to use two hands can shape your thinking and the strategies you use.
Right. They could move multiple blocks at once, keep track of different groups by touch. It's a different experience than just working with pencil and paper.
Totally. But then there's also that study with the molecular models, the tangible interface. It wasn't completely free manipulation, but it was constrained in a way that actually helped people learn more effectively.
So it's a balance, isn't it, between giving people enough freedom to explore and providing some structure to guide their learning.
Exactly. And the jigsaw puzzle task showed that too. The physical puzzles and the tangible digital puzzles where you could use two hands, they both led to more of those epistemic actions, that exploration and experimentation that helps you understand the problem better.
Okay, so to sum up embedded cognition, it seems like manipulatives can be really powerful because they let you reduce your cognitive load through that interaction.
All right, you're offloading some of the thinking onto the environment.
But we have to be careful about how much structure we provide, because if we do too much of the thinking for people, they might not develop their own problem-solving skills and transfer.
Absolutely. It's
You,
all about finding that sweet spot. And then, of course, we also have to consider the physicality of the materials themselves, because those physical properties, they actually shape the way you interact with them. They create affordances like being able to use two hands and constraints like limiting the ways you can move something.
and even just the way they look and feel, that can influence how usable they are.
Right, because how we perceive something as a tool, that influences how we use it. So the takeaway here is that richness isn't necessarily bad. It's about understanding how that richness, that physicality, can actually invite specific kinds of interactions that can be really beneficial for learning.
Okay, that was a lot on embedded cognition. Now let's move on to the second big idea, embodied cognition.
This is another fascinating perspective.
What's the core idea for you?
Well, the core idea here is that cognition, it's not this abstract process that's detached from your body. It's actually grounded in your sensor motor experiences.
Yeah.
What you perceive with your senses, how you move your body, all of that shapes the way you think.
So while the traditional view of learning often talks about transferring knowledge by learning these general decontextualized rules, embodied cognition suggests that our thinking is much more deeply connected to our actual physical experiences.
Exactly. It's not just that we learn through our senses and actions, it's that our very understanding of the world is shaped by them. Like even when you're just thinking about something, your brain is drawing on those past sensor motor experiences.
Wow, so like a much more direct link. The article mentioned something called Barsalou's perceptual symbol systems account. What is that?
Oh, that's a really interesting model. It basically tries to explain how this grounding of cognition in sensomotor experience actually works in the brain. So the idea is that when you interact with the world, your brain isn't just processing information in some abstract way. It's actually activating specific patterns of neural activity across your sensory and motor areas. And those patterns, they get stored as what Barsalou calls perceptual symbols. So it's like instead of storing abstract ideas, your brain is storing records of your experiences.
Like instead of the word apple, your brain stores the feeling of holding an apple, the smell of it, the taste of it, all combined.
Right. And then when you think about an apple, you're basically reactivating those perceptual symbols. It's like a simulation based on your past experiences.
That makes sense. And there's actually a lot of evidence that our thinking really is intertwined with our sensory-motor system, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. Like studies have shown that just reading words like cinnamon or grasp can activate those brain regions associated with smell and hand movements.
So it's not just about concrete objects. Even abstract words can trigger those sensory and motor responses.
Right. And even when you're doing mental math, brain areas associated with finger movements often show increased activity.
So how does all of this relate back to learning with manipulatives? The article talks about three main lines of research looking at transfer. Let's start with how we might transfer learning through internalizing these sensor-motor experiences.
Right. That's a great place to start, because this line of research fits really well with the embodied cognition perspective. It suggests that when you use manipulatives, you're not just learning about the manipulative itself, you're actually internalizing those sensory motor routines that the manipulative facilitates. And the abacus is a perfect example of this.
Like how those expert users can perform these incredibly complex calculations mentally, almost like they're manipulating a mental abacus.
It's amazing, isn't it? And they're often even faster and more accurate mentally than they are when they're using a physical abacus. And studies have shown that if you try to disrupt their thinking by having them do a verbal task at the same time, it doesn't affect their mental calculation. but it does affect normal people.
So it's like they're using a completely different system that's based on those sensor motor representations. And that study that compared physical and virtual abacus training, that really highlights the importance of the physical experience, right?
Right, because even though both groups did equally well on tasks like recognizing numbers on the abacus, the people who trained on the virtual abacus, they struggled more when they had to perform operations on a physical abacus. So that initial sensor-motor experience seems to be really important for later transfer to a physical context.
It seems like this process of internalizing embodied knowledge happens gradually, like kids eventually stop using their fingers when they count.
Right, it's a gradual shift from relying on that external physical support to more internalized mental representations. We see this with chess players too. Like more experienced players, they rely less on the actual board. They can play more moves in their head. And the study on mental tic-tac-toe showed that external perceptual support is most helpful when the task is really demanding, especially for people who don't have great spatial abilities.
It's like the external support helps to stabilize those mental representations. And that idea that people who gesture more when they talk tend to have lower spatial imagery abilities, that kind of supports this too, doesn't it?
Totally. It's like those gestures are helping them to create a more stable representation in their mind. So the idea is that when you're learning with manipulatives, you're not just building abstract knowledge, you're also building these internal sensorimotor routines that you can then draw on later.
Okay, now let's move on to that second line of research on transfer, the one about simulating texts and science scenarios. How does that connect to embodied cognition?
Well, here the idea is that manipulatives give you a way to ground those abstract concepts and narratives in concrete sensorimotor experiences. Like, studies have shown that if kids physically act out a story, they tend to remember it better. They can make more inferences about what happened. And they even develop a better understanding of the spatial relationships.
Oh, that makes sense. Because you're not just reading the words, you're actually experiencing the story with your body.
Right. You're creating a richer, more embodied representation of the information. And that makes it more accessible and meaningful.
But the article also mentions that sometimes virtual manipulatives can be just as effective, and that even just watching someone else act out a story can be beneficial.
Right. And that's important because it shows that mental simulation doesn't always require direct physical interaction. Like when you watch someone else do something, it can activate similar neural pathways in your own brain, leading to a kind of vicarious embodiment.
So even though you're not doing the action yourself, your brain is still simulating it.
Exactly. And if the key information for understanding the text is already visually present in a virtual manipulative, that might be enough to trigger those mental simulations.
Now, when we look at studies comparing physical and virtual manipulatives in science education, we sometimes see no difference in learning outcomes, or even a negative effect of physical manipulatives. That seems to contradict the idea that physical is always better.
Yeah, and this is where we need to be careful about oversimplifying things. Embodied cognition doesn't say that just adding tactile information will always lead to better learning. It's more nuanced than that.
So what does it say then?
It says that sensory motor experience is going to be most important when you're learning about concepts that are fundamentally grounded in that specific kind of sensory information. Like, your understanding of mass is based on how heavy something feels, how much space it takes up, maybe even the sound it makes when you drop it. So those different sensory experiences are all part of what mass means to you.
So for something like understanding how an electrical circuit works, where the key concepts might be more about the flow of energy, which isn't really tangible, the physicality of the components might not be as important.
Exactly. And that study with the kindergartners learning about mass and balance beams, that kind of supports this idea.
Yeah.
The physical manipulatives, they only really help the kids who started out with wrong ideas about mass. So it was like the direct sensor motor experience helped them to correct those misconceptions.
So it's about grounding those concepts that aren't already well grounded in our everyday experience.
Exactly. And that's why virtual manipulatives might work just fine for text comprehension. Because if the key information is visually presented, that might be enough to trigger the necessary mental simulations.
Okay, so now let's talk about that third line of research, transfer through replacement, where the manipulative is standing in for something else.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting in terms of how embodied cognition relates to the moderate view. Because here, the findings seem to align more with that idea that too much perceptual richness can actually hinder learning.
How so?
Well, one of the key studies in this area looked at how well young kids could find a hidden toy in a real room after they had explored a model of the room.
Oh, interesting.
And what they found was that the kids who used a really detailed 3D model, they actually did worse than the kids who used a simpler 2D map. And this is explained by the dual representation hypothesis. So the idea is that when you're using a concrete object to represent something else, you have to understand both the object itself and what it represents. And the more perceptually rich that object is, the harder it can be to focus on that symbolic relationship. Like the kids got so caught up in the details of the model that they had trouble connecting it to the real room.
Okay, that makes sense. And then there's that research on learning abstract mathematical concepts. Sometimes using more abstract representations right from the start can actually be more effective for transfer than using concrete manipulatives.
Right, like that study with the cupcakes versus the circles. The kids who learned with the cupcakes, they might have understood the initial concept, but they had more trouble applying it to other situations where there weren't cupcakes involved. It's like they got stuck on the specific features of the cupcakes and didn't really grasp the abstract mathematical relationship.
So when the manipulative is acting as a symbol, less perceptual richness might actually be better for understanding those underlying abstract concepts.
That seems to be the case. And the idea of concreteness fading, where you gradually move from those very concrete examples to more abstract representations, that seems like a promising approach for bridging that gap.
So to summarize our discussion on embodied cognition, it seems like transfer doesn't always require a concrete to abstract shift. Sometimes it can happen through internalizing those sensoromotor routines. And the benefit of perceptual richness really depends on the context and what you're trying to learn.
Exactly. Like for more abstract learning goals, manipulatives might be most effective when they act as what they call surrogate situations. They provide a concrete surface for engaging your sensoromotor routines, but they minimize any unnecessary perceptual details.
So you can focus on the underlying structure. And even things like the spacing between symbols in an algebraic equation, those visual cues can actually help ground those abstract relationships in sensorimotor experience.
That's right. It's about finding ways to leverage our embodied nature to support abstract thinking.
Wow, this has been such a fascinating deep dive. So for our listener, what are the key takeaways from all of this?
Well, the moderate view reminds us that we have to be mindful of cognitive overload, and that eventually we need to move towards more symbolic representations for broader transfer.
But the embedded and embodied cognition and perspectives, they highlight how crucial our physical interactions and sensory experiences are for learning.
Exactly. It's not just about abstract thinking. Our bodies and the environment play a vital role in shaping how we understand the world.
And it's not as simple as saying more richness is always better.
Right. The effectiveness of perceptual and interactive richness, it really depends on what you're trying to learn, the nature of the material itself, and what your ultimate goals are.
It sounds like there's still a lot more research to be done in this area.
Definitely. Like, how can we design manipulatives that really optimize the interplay between embedded and embodied cognition? How do different types of interaction affect long-term memory and transfer?
And the article mentioned tangible user interfaces as a promising area for future research.
Yeah, it's an exciting field. It's really blurring the lines between physical and digital interaction.
This has given me a lot to think about. Now, for you, our listener, as you reflect on your own learning experiences, think about which ones have been most impactful for you. Were they filled with sensory details, or did they provide just enough interaction for you to internalize the core concepts? How might understanding these principles change the way you approach your own learning, or even how you might teach something new to someone else? That's something to ponder this week. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.